Zimbabwe's government has denied targeting journalist Hopewell Chin'ono and politician Jacob Ngarivhume for their anti-corruption stance. They were arrested on Monday and charged with inciting public violence. This in connection with the planned national demonstration on July 31st against corruption in government as well as poor service delivery. Chin'ono and Ngarivhume were both denied bail by the Harare Magistrate Court, which found they would continue inciting public violence. Government accuses the pair of attempting to overthrow the government with the full support of so-called Western forces.
For the avoidance of doubt, Hopewell Chin'ono was not abducted. He was lawfully arrested by the Zimbabwe Republic Police, and he was not arrested for exposing corruption. He was arrested for using his social media accounts to incite Zimbabweans to violently overthrow the government. The arrest of these two, that's Hopewell Chin'ono and Ngarivhume individuals, clearly has nothing to do with their anti-corruption stance, which finds convergence with President E.D. Mnangagwa's own position, but their ploy to violently destabilize the country and unconstitutionally seize power by any means necessary, thus putting Zimbabwean lives and property at risk. The role of foreign powers in this plot to instigate an illegal regime change in Zimbabwe is made apparent by a set of events and statements that followed the police operation. Within minutes of arrival of the police at Mr. Chin'ono's home, the U.S. Embassy was already all over this issue, which is between a sovereign country and its citizens, by tweeting and trying to bring pressure to bear on the Zimbabwean government so it would not enforce the law of the land. Its particular interest in this one person is curious in the list. Other Western embassies, who usually take the USA's lead, joined in this irregular interference by tweeting and releasing statements which were calculated to obstruct the course of justice in a hosting country.
And now to talk about the plight of journalists in Southern Africa and on the African continent, Angela Quintal is the Africa Program Coordinator at the Committee to Protect Journalists. She joins us via Skype now. A very good evening to you, Angela. Thank you so much for speaking to us. Let's just perhaps start with that particular story in Zimbabwe. Just how possible is it that a journalist who is writing about corruption, by doing so, can be accused of trying to overthrow the government with the help of Western agents?
Hi there, Tsepiso. Thanks so much for having me on the show, and hello to all your viewers. Yeah, I guess we need to get past the spin of the minister, and let's just look at the facts. And let's look at a Zimbabwean rights group like the Zimbabwean chapter of the Lisa Institute of Southern Africa, who just this week alone, in front of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, actually raised concerns about what was happening to journalists in Zimbabwe after the COVID-19 lockdown, which began in April. And they included not only Hopewell's case, but countless others, because there have been at least 25 violations of free speech and attacks, intimidation, the detention of journalists in Zimbabwe. And it's very easy, and we've seen it not only Zimbabwe alone, but throughout the continent and elsewhere in the world. When governments are cracking down on critics, on dissent, they invariably will invoke anti-state charges to try and justify their actions against those that they wish to detain. And what has happened to Hopewell is a perfect example of this. And let me just say to your viewers, though, the facts do speak for themselves. Have a look at what the ZANU-PF government spokesman, Patrick Chinamasa, said last month in June, special press conference called to attack Hopewell. Why? Because Hopewell had raised concerns and had written about alleged corruption in the procurement of COVID-19 supplies in Zimbabwe. So it's a bit difficult, with respect, to believe a minister when she says what she says, when everyone heard what Patrick Chinamasa of ZANU-PF said.
And Angela, let me jump in there quickly and say it's interesting that when Hopewell first wrote the story about the alleged corruption, the health minister was then dismissed. But then when he started asking questions about the possible connection of the president's son, this is when the trouble began. Would you agree that the criticism some have made that COVID-19 has brought about with it conditions for governments to trample on human rights, as was cited from the very onset in China when lockdown proceedings were instituted?
Look, there's no doubt about that. It's not only governments who are seen as being authoritarian, but frankly, COVID has given governments the license to do exactly that, to crack down on fundamental rights. And we've seen it throughout the continent, and we've seen it elsewhere in the world. We've seen it in our own country. We've seen it in neighboring Eswatini. We've seen it in Zimbabwe, Botswana, Nigeria, Kenya, Cameroon. It's something that unfortunately has given government, and particularly the state apparatuses, those security forces who seem to feel that they now have a license to act against ordinary citizens with impunity, that this is what is happening. And that is what is the great shame. And this is why we are saying that it is, when we see how journalists are being targeted, ultimately it is not a case of journalists themselves being targeted, but the greater problem here is that citizens of the countries are the ones that are being denied their basic human rights in terms of access to information, access to diverse information from a plurality of sources.
Angela, what is the plight of journalists, especially in the Southern African region, but the Africa as a whole, just looking at COVID-19 and how it's impacted them on their freedom of expression and just the ability to do their work? I'm thinking of a case in Ethiopia where a journalist there, Yaya Soshimelis, was himself arrested for publishing a report on coronavirus simply because the government did not agree with him. Are we seeing a lot of these instances?
We definitely are, and the Committee to Protect Journalists has been documenting all these incidents. So we have certainly seen an uptick on that. So while journalists themselves are on the front lines and are at greater risk of contracting COVID-19, they're also then faced with the sort of repression that we are seeing, which is why just this week, the Committee to Protect Journalists and other organizations in Southern Africa, like the South African National Editors Forum, the Southern African Editors Forum, Media Monitoring Africa, actually wrote a letter to President Ramaphosa in his capacity as the African Union chair to say, look, you need to start taking measures here. One, it's no good arresting journalists and then claiming, that they are accused of anti-state charges when we know that this is actually an attempt to crack down on ordinary citizens getting the truth from their governments, right? So what we did ask the president to do in his capacity as the AU chair is to actually ensure that not only are all people like Hopewell released from jail, but all other journalists who are currently in jail in a situation of COVID-19, where frankly being in detention is actually a death sentence. And why do I say it's a death sentence? It's a death sentence because just 2-3 weeks ago, you had an Egyptian journalist who died in pretrial detention from COVID-19. We have the World Health Organization saying that the people who are in detention are at greater risk of contracting COVID-19. You have journalists and others in appalling conditions. I mean, we just have to look at Cameroon, which is now the second worst jailer of journalists in sub-Saharan Africa, where you have journalists in Condengui prison in Yaoundé, in possibly what is a hellhole. I mean, people like Amnesty have documented how bad conditions are there, that they face the risk of dying in prison simply because of their journalism. And it is time that the African Union and President Ramaphosa, in his capacity as AU chair, that people start putting their money where their mouths are. It is no good, as the African Union did last year when the African Commission on Human and People's Rights actually then decided that it was time, and they did. They adopted the Declaration on the Principles of Freedom of Expression and Access to Information. And in there, you're talking about ensuring that journalists and others are protected. And yet the very governments that are signatories are doing this. And that's why we're appealing to President Ramaphosa to do something about this.
All right. Thank you so much, Angela. Angela Quintal is Africa Program Coordinator at the Committee to Protect Journalists.